La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia. Vincere!
Hello noble ones! I've recently released a thought-provoking video titled "Was Nazism left-wing or right-wing?" This video, as I had expected, has created a little bit of a fuss, if you will. A ripple in the lake, a storm in the blue and red sky, I suppose. A dent in the matrix. The primary objective was to elucidate the inherent limitations of reductionist categorization within the political paradigm, and to propose a more nuanced framework for understanding complex historical phenomena. This way, encouraging the viewer to make their own mind and come to their own conclusion, applying critical thinking. A skill that I want to say we are slowly losing. Well, some people got it 100%, other people completely missed the point, and then you've got those that believe that, you shouldn't be allowed to speak if you disagree with them. Excellent Nazi tactic, by the way. On a positive note instead, we've got two historians, these two gentlemen, that made response videos to my original video, and I think these were absolutely fantastic. I love it for a change when people are actually respectful in the way they make response videos to me instead of like, liar, liar, liar. So thank you so much guys for responding, really appreciate it, you are awesome, and I will leave link to the response videos down below. New policy: if you are respectful in your responses, whether you agree with me or not, you get featured. No, not you. As for the original video, today's video's core tenet and focal point is to provide an opportunity for reflection on two things. One, the faulty nature of the question proper, as some things just don't jive with the elements we expect from the right and left dichotomy. Two, the inadequacy of 21st century politics in a 20th century context as a heuristic device. And I mean, this shouldn't really surprise us. At the end of the day, this binary model doesn't really leave much space for nuance, does it? As stated in the original video, I still suggest that the fundamentals of this question, was it left-wing or right-wing, is in fact incongruent, particularly when viewed from a 21st century perspective, and often an American one at that, when the topic of discussion is indeed 20th century European extreme political regimes. We expose therefore the contingencies of time and space that make the framing of the question somewhat invalid or not apt for delineating and accurately describing these 20th century's historical parties. Moreover, the video offered a third option. By describing these regimes as totalitarian dictatorships instead, rather than trying to fit them in a left or right box, we could successfully shift the focus to the regime's operational mechanics, ideological underpinnings, and sociopolitical impacts. Just like I mentioned on the first video when talking about the word or the slur Nazi, today we're talking about the word fascist. But once again, when this is used as a way to just attack or insult the other side or the opposite of your political persuasion, even though that's very common, personally I find it to be a rather useless and unproductive exercise. I ask, is it useful critically to use this language at this point in time? And besides, let's also remember that just calling someone a fascist doesn't make it so. Discourse, rather than insults, in my opinion, are in fact the best dynamic. Well, be that as it may, after I finish with this video and I present all of my information, if you still want to use fascist as a way to insult your political opponents, I mean, freedom of speech. But at least you'll know exactly what you're saying. Because at the end of the day, we all know fascism is bad. Great. But what does it mean to be a fascist? What is fascism? Now, do you remember the section of my original video where I demonstrated how historically the Nazis, the fascist and communist regimes took away your freedom of speech as a result of their, authoritarian struggle for utter control of the masses? Well, in light of that, today I ask the question, was fascism left-wing or right-wing? I ask it because the very suppression of such inquiries mirrors, ironically, the very totalitarian practices of fascist regimes. And to all those that tell me, don't you dare speaking about this again? Very fascist of you. Gentile and Mussolini would be proud. I ask it because you and I are free to inquire with dignity. Therefore, I don't just ask this question today, but I also ask you to continue to ask it, so that this may never happen again. Was fascism left-wing or right-wing? Historically, the Partito Nazionale Fascista's government of Italy from 1922 to 1943 is traditionally demarcated into three evolutionary phases: the seizure of power, consolidation, and expansion, the latter often regarded as the regime's most oppressive period. This tripartite periodization offers a framework for analyzing the regime's progression an impact. Benito Musolini, commonly referred to as Il Duce, emerges as a pivotal figure in the 20th century European history. His ascension to power in Italy and the subsequent establishment of a fascist state had profound implications not only for Italy, but for the global political landscape. Born in 1883 in the provincial town of Predappio, Mussolini's formative years were characterized by socialist inclinations mixed with nationalistic sentiments. The March on Rome in October 1922 marked a critical juncture in Mussolini's rise to power. This orchestrated show of force effectively intimidated the Italian government, and King Vittorio Emanuele III, faced with the prospects of civil war, capitulated, appointing Mussolini as prime minister. This event heralded the inception of fascist rule in Italy, a regime that would endure until 1943. But now let's start focusing a little bit more on the minds of those persons that created it. In this case, the father of its theory, Giovanni Gentile, and the executing arm. Mussolini could easily be described as a demagogue. So, what is a demagogue? Well, in this context, this word refers to people who practice the idea of gaining support through the exploitation of popular desires and prejudices rather than through rational argument or moral principle. Mussolini's rhetorical strategy was predicated on arousing the emotions of the populace, often at the expense of logical coherence or ethical considerations. In this sense, one could say that Mussolini's political success was his embodiment of the demagogue archetype. The approach employed by Mussolini can be characterized by 1. Emotional manipulation, 2. Simplification of complex issues, 3. Scapegoating, in other words, identifying and vilifying perceived enemies of the state or society, and 4. Charismatic performance. And when it comes to this last one, look at this. We're gonna check an original clip now. I mean, I've already shown a few, but check this one out. Look at the body language.
Aveva Cesare, il figlio ed Augusto.
You see, according to Gentile, one of the main and prominent thinkers that are behind the concept of fascism, there is no distinction between the private interest and the public interest, and everything should be subordinate to the state. Let's now do a little bit of preliminary exploratory research. If we open the Wikipedia page on fascism, you'll notice that it says that fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, ultranationalistic political ideology and movement. Now that is because in Europe, conventionally, that's the way it's taught. In Europe, being the key. This is normally based on the fact that fascism opposed communism, and communism being at the extreme end of the left-wing paradigm, whenever we want to look at it this way, fascists being in strong opposition against specifically Bolshevik communists, then of course it creates a kind of a neat dichotomy. Not to mention that there are parties in Italy that do derive from the ashes of the fascist movement, and they all, in this case, right-wing. Although of course they're not as extreme, I mean, obviously. But when we start looking at this from the American perspective, then things change, and the situation becomes more nuanced, if you will. Fascism was big on public healthcare, the emergence of health policies with distinct fascist characteristics, which occurred in the late 1920s. When we look at the consolidated structure of the fascist healthcare state, we'll see that it can be divided into three main constituents. The new welfare-based, called enti pubblici, the traditional ministerial bureaucracies, and local services. And in this case, when it comes to the focus or even fixation, one could say, on public health, the reason was, generally speaking, to foster population growth. Now, of course, there is nothing wrong with fostering population growth, but when you're under this, it does have to be connected to then exploitation, extreme taxation, military expansionism, and in general increasing the number of subjects. And this expanded in 1925 with the Italian fascist regime created the Opera Nazionale Maternità ed Infanzia, which combined social welfare with the realization of the regime's demographic aims. So, public healthcare, big government, socialist roots, as I'll discuss on section 8, all of this makes it sound left-wing from an American perspective. But before we jump into the actual policies, let me swap the colors. And literally, for all the American friends of the platform, this is so confusing. Like, I get it that you wanted to use blue and red because those are the colors you've got on your flag. Beautiful flag, by the way. But then again, red everywhere else is the commies. Anyways, you do you, whatever color you like. What do I know? We will focus on the theoretical fundamentals of fascism, which is one thing, and then the practical expressions of fascism, such as, for example, party organization, system of education, legislation, which then of course irreversibly bled into the education system proper. After all, as anyone who has ever studied history can tell you, nothing in politics happens by accident. Let's talk about the nature of fascism.
Combattenti di terra, di mare, dell'aria, camicie nere della rivoluzione e delle legioni.
I personally reckon that fascism should absolutely be studied deeply, as its impact on European history was, one could say, incalculable. However, even though up to a certain extent we all know what fascism is, in reality, when you really think about it at an ontological level, its nature, its taxonomic and definitional characteristics may be elusive after all. I will strongly justify this statement later on this video. Sure, fascism did have its academic theoreticians, but then again someone can also argue that fascism has no intellectual basis. It is in fact a baseless ideology. Let me defend that. When examining Benito Mussolini's boastful balcony speeches, someone could say, well, in the words of Roger Scruton, that they are in fact an amalgam of disparate conceptions, which present a complex tapestry of political thought. This highlights the heterogeneous nature of fascist ideology, which is an ideology of opportunity, but in a negative sense. This poses significant challenges for scholars attempting to formulate a unified theory of fascism. Professor Herney Turner Jr. astutely observes the recurrent pattern in fascism studies. Open quotes. Anyone who reads many studies on fascism as a multinational phenomenon cannot but be struck by the frequency with which writers who begin by assuming they are dealing with a unitary phenomenon end up with several more or less discrete subcategories. Regardless of what criteria are applied, it seems very difficult to keep fascism from fragmenting. Close quotes. Turner's observations underscores a fundamental epistemological problem in the study of fascism, the tension between the desire for a comprehensive, universally applicable definition and the historical reality of diverse fascist movements with distinct national characteristics. This tension has led to a proliferation of subcategories and typologies within fascism studies, each attempting to capture the nuances of specific historical manifestations. And it is this very persistent fragmentation of fascism when placed under actual, rigorous analytical scrutiny that presents us with a question. What defines fascism? Well, Turner posits a provocative hypothesis. He says, open quotes, that fascism as a generic concept has no validity and is without value for serious analytical purposes. Close quotes. This assertion should lead us to the re-evaluation of our basic assumptions about fascism. The nature of fascism in its fundamental values is in fact an old-school debate, so to help us define it, we should look not only at the minds that created it, but also, if not most importantly, the geopolitical situation and societal conditions that began its gestation in the early 1900s. Fascism intuition is a system of ideas evolving within the framework of a historical moment, cemented due to specific historical conditions, that facilitated an intellectual conversion towards the unitary conceptualization of dictatorial regimes. Just like any other ideology, fascism is a construct of the mind, so understanding the sort of societal pressures under which the mind created the concept of fascism is paramount to our investigation. Fascist ideology was fortified through the employment of fear-mongering tactics and manipulative strategies, adeptly exploiting the anxieties, discontents and prejudices prevalent in a society experiencing an economic crisis. It is crucial to note that the establishment of the regime's primary institution coincided with the zenith of the Great Depression that occurred in Italia in 1932. So, if you forget anything I say on this video, remember this. Fascism doesn't happen in a happy, thriving, and successful society. Therefore, here is my first definitional trait. Fascism is a symptom of societal collapse. The fascist ideology stands in diametric opposition to the principles of individualism, and it categorically rejects the notions of competitive elections. It manifests a unitary, autocratic regime that systematically and often violently suppressed any forms of perceived political dissent. The fascist state's modus operandi is characterized by ruthless extirpation of pluralistic political expression and the imposition of a monolithic power structure, the one-party system. So, at any point, if you see even a modern political party that tries to push the idea of a one-party system, that you can absolutely call fascist on any side of the political spectrum, because at the end of the day, extremes touch. It's the horseshoe effect. And talking about individualism, in Benito Mussolini's own words, Benito Mussolini himself publicly stated that fascism is anti-individualistic and accepts the individual only in as far as the interests coincide with those of the state. So in other words, the fundamental trait that I'm trying to present today as we try to define what fascism is, it's its innate ideological fluidity, or hybridity, if you will, which is what allows it to connect easily with extremist ideas even when their core principles are different. Fascism is characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized authority, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, usually belief in a natural social hierarchy, subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation, a strong regimentation of society, big government, and control of the economy. Now, it's important to underline, however, that historically the control of the economy did not happen, at least in the very beginning. It's a little bit of a late stage version of fascism. What I mean by that is that initial fascist policies and positions when it comes to the economy were based on two major elements. Early fascist government was a massive proponent of privatization, and it pushed the idea of lowering taxes. Of course, to a modern American, both of these ideas would sound right-wing. With that being said, let's have a look at late iteration fascism. The economy that characterized fascism after Mussolini had consolidated power was what we could call a dirigist economy, which is a market economy in which the state plays a strong directive role through economic interventionism and policies. All of this with the principal goal of achieving what is called autarky, or national economic self-sufficiency, a sort of state-directed capitalism which had some common elements with socialism that normally you call corporatism. This gave the fascists the ability to confiscate assets at their will while controlling the vast majority of Italy's credit, generated by the workforce. Yet now it doesn't sound right-wing anymore, does it? So why was there this fundamental change between early fascism and late fascism? Well, most likely the early fascist positions on economy and all of that privatization when it comes to, for example, putting an end to the state control of life insurance, just to give you one, was a way to gain the votes and support of the bourgeoisie. And in fact, at the very beginning, when fascists raised to power, the Minister of Finance and Economy was a centrist, Alberto De Stefani, who was a massive supporter of free market, an element in common with modern-day American right-wing. That's until 1925, which is when Mussolini fired him. What about the promise of lowering taxes? Oh, at first they did, but towards the end of the regime, what Mussolini ended up doing was raising taxes. And I mean a lot. And this in a way shouldn't really surprise us, because as we will see, Mussolini's roots were socialists, in the sense that this idea of collective sacrifice through taxation in order to give more power and more capability to the state was something that he had believed for over 14 years. So even though after being expulsed from the Socialist Party, as we will see in a second, and having this massive shift in political allegiances, his core tenets when it came to economy, as we see after he consolidated power, were still clearly rooted in socialism. That's where the situation starts to become confusing. Because you see, even though this idea of big state, big government controlling the economy and having a lot to say when it comes to people's everyday lives clearly makes it sound left-wing from an American modern perspective, but then again, how much of the GDP did the fascists spend for the strengthening of the military and for law and order? Both concepts that tend to be quite right-wing today, at least in modern-day America. Because I mean, what about the military strength and spending budgets of the Soviets of the USSR. You see why this is confusing? Another aspect that we can discuss is the idea of collective identity within the concept of the state. So the idea of the ultra-nationalism of fascists of 1940s Italy. Now, given, once again, if we want to look at this from the spectrum of modern American politics, then if we were to look at the average liberal versus the average conservative, then the ultra-nationalistic types tend to be found more often on the right wing of the spectrum. With that being said, what happens if we look at modern-day China? That is very nationalistic, but it's communist. As a last point, when it comes to the economy, there is one thing that I would like to say that I did forget to mention on my original video on Nazism when discussing the economic policies, and that is the idea of a wartime economy, which is of course different from a peacetime economy. Now, this is something that was one of the elements of discussion brought up by this historian, and since he brought it up very eloquently, we're going to listen to him now.
Wartime is a completely different animal compared to peacetime. You know, people like to point at Abraham Lincoln and say what a tyrant he was because of certain things he did in times of war, in times of rebellion. Would he have done those things in times of peace, which is what really, to me, determines what kind of a leader you are.
Thank you very much, Vlogging Through History. A very fair point. Another thing that is, common knowledge, but perhaps not everyone is aware of, is the fact that Mussolini, before becoming the Duce, and even before just starting the fascist movement, he was a socialist, in the sense that for 14 years he was a member, and in fact a very active member, of the Italian Socialist Party. The thing is that the Socialist Party during World War I was advocating for neutrality during the war, whereby Mussolini was already at that time a war agitator, so he completely disagreed, we could say, with the remaining members of the party, which led to his expulsion, something that clearly he wasn't very happy about. This is where we see historically a massive shift when it comes to Mussolini as a socialist himself, and then a pro-socialist, all the way up to considering the socialists as his enemies, and in fact starting hating the communists. So once again, this can be confusing, because when you hear socialist, oh, left wing, and then you hear, but he hates the commies, well, that sounds right wing. This once again connects to the opportunistic nature of fascism as a doctrine, if you will, to accumulate power. That is really the focal point, whether it be Nazism, whether it be communism, whether it be fascism. That is the focal point of dictatorships, is that their main objective, since they are totalitarian regimes, is to accumulate power by any means necessary. And these sort of leaders, these generational personae in a negative sense, are willing to say anything, muster any flag, wear any color, as long as it takes and helps them focus and concentrate power. That's why, as I say, and as I said on the previous video, and as I will continue to say on this series, left-wing, right-wing, particularly from a modern perspective, isn't the best way to classify these historical regimes. In fact, all of them. They are dictatorial regimes. They are totalitarian dictatorships. It should have its own box and nomenclature. Regardless, this is what historically leads Mussolini's shift, and when he starts the fascist movement called Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, and the rest is history. Alright, but what about Benito Mussolini's fixation with the past and recreating and bringing back the strength of ancient Rome, for example, so the past glory? This, of course, has to do with the type of propaganda that Mussolini was using. Fascism occurred during a time of crisis, so of course if people or the citizen are experiencing crisis and you present to them, well, look at the past, things were better back then clearly that's gonna work on a lot of them, and that's something that we see happening since the times of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. In fact, during the Roman Empire, what were the senatorial class and quite a few historians saying? Well, they were saying things were better during the Republic, we should bring it back. So that's nothing new. It's something that politicians have been doing constantly to gain public support. And clearly, from a modern perspective, this being the key, if we look at Mussolini's values, of course they're going to sound very conservative, but then again, these are the 40s. In a similar way, if we were to ask ourselves what would Benito Mussolini think about, for example, minority rights or LGBTQ rights, yeah, he's going to be anti-homosexuals, he's going to be opposed to anything that has to do with transgender, but that doesn't make him right-wing in the modern sense, it just makes him a person from his period. Because once again, the reason why I say this is not, yes, it sounds more like some elements of the right in America, but then again, you would have found the exact same type of opposition in communist USSR. You think Stalin would have been, oh yeah, a massive proponent of minority rights and a supporter of LGBT? Well, no, and yet he's very far left, right? So as you can see, that's the problem when we overlap the present with the past. Things don't work that way. Therefore, such comparisons become futile. When it comes to foreign policy, Mussolini sought to expand Italy's influence and territories. This led to the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and, as we all know, an alliance with the Nazi during World War II. Both decisions that will be disastrous for Italian history. What about the idea of authoritarianism? Can that be defined as something either right-wing or left-wing? Well, once again, it's one of those situations where no, it can't. Because if you look at all sorts of authoritarian regimes throughout history, whether they be far left, far right, however you want to call them, authoritarianism is something that occurs at the extreme ends of both sections of the political axis. Excusing the term. Horseshoe effect does end up in authoritarianism, particularly when individual rights and personal freedom and liberty are undermined. This is why hopefully this study in particular, in this video essay, can provide valuable lessons when it comes to the nature of power, the importance of anti-despotic safeguards, and the consequences of unchecked authoritarianism, which in my opinion are topics that are orders of magnitude more important and worth of study than just trying to decide, yeah, but are they left-wing or are they right-wing? Wouldn't you agree? Fascism clearly is a sort of third position, elements of the right and the left, but not strictly on either side. Historically, once in power, Mussolini gradually dismantled democratic institutions. He suppressed opposition, pushed nationalistic propaganda, focused on traditional values, while implementing corporatist economic policies. So we could say that fascisms are political movements that aim to take over the state, destroying classical liberal institutions like the independent media and individual rights. Fascists also make use of everything, and when talking about the media, of course this connects to propaganda. Link in the description. The post-war period in Italy was characterized by economic hardship, social unrest and political instability. Mussolini capitalized on these conditions, presenting fascism as a solution to Italy's problems. He promised to restore order, revive the economy, and return Italy to its former glory. His charismatic speeches and the militant actions of his black shirts gained him an unprecedented success. But regardless of that very success, Mussolini will be executed by a partisan at the end of the war after the Axis had been defeated by the Allies, and he will die having been shot by machine gun fire 9 times on his chest around his heart. One of the main problems that someone may have when trying to comprehend anything from the perspective of the past, distant or near, is the fact that we're all children of our time. Therefore, some concepts, expressions, or even events may be difficult to understand or to fully comprehend. So a great way to dig deeper into this without prejudice is to study the mind of those who were from that period and spoke about it. So today I've prepared a section from Benito Mussolini's own autobiography, written by him, and a section from the book he co-authored with another main fascist persona, Giovanni Gentile. Last but not least, one cannot talk about fascism without reading directly from Giuseppe Borghese. Let's go. Giuseppe Antonio Borghese is a very important writer, journalist, literary critic, poet. As you can see here, this is his page on Wikipedia, and among his works there is one in particular that has a whole section on fascism that is, in my opinion, very apt and excellent at explaining the roots of fascism in Italy in context. It's called Goliath, the March of Fascism from 1937. He has a whole section on tyranny. It's a fantastic. Part 4 is very good, but I would like to focus now specifically on the following pages. Check this out. He writes, "It is now well known to everybody that the assumption according to which fascism came up as an emergency defense of Italy against an impending Bolshevik peril is not substantiated by facts." Then there is the part where he talks about and he says, "In Italy, in spite of an economic and social situation objectively more difficult than in France or elsewhere." And this is the part that I was talking about the economic conditions. Now here's the crucial part. The Scarlet Phantom evoked and gigantized by the Italian fascists in search for a retrospective rationalization of their deed became easily popular wherever similar crimes needed similar exonerating circumstances. It was to be highly successful in Germany, and its automatic performances were, and still are, insistently rehearsed in France and in other countries as well. But if the Bolshevik peril, as vulgar opinion sees it, consisted of violence, tyranny, and infringement of the rights to the individual expression and free use of personal property, it is quite clear that fascism was the particular sort of Bolshevism allotted to Italy and later to Germany, and that only through fascism and Nazism did those features of oppression and subversion materialize in both countries. See, change the colors, change a few policies, change the nomenclature, still the same kind of anti-freedom tyranny. Exactly my point. To be sure, several industrialists and bankers, but not all of them, helped Mussolini with advice and money. It may be accurate to contend that without the support of that section of capitalism, fascism would not have conquered the country. This is, however, not tantamount to saying that the rise of Mussolini and fascism can and must be explained as a merely economic happening, and that fascism must be described as an aggressive defense, a sally of besieged capitalism. If such explanation were apt, we should have seen and should see some sort of fascism wherever capitalism and property are menaced. Fascinating. Even those among the capitalists who joined and fed the fascist movement were inspired by passion far more than by interest. Now this is pivotal. This is very important and a very good point. A lot of people, I want to argue even today, they vote based on their emotions. I want to say the majority of voters vote with their guts. If you were to sit down and review every single policy proposed by all sorts of governments, some people that support one side might actually end up agreeing with the other more. But because it's very much of an appeal that politicians use to people's irrational aspects of their personality and their humanity, the emotional aspect of it, we do vote by passion as humans, and politicians knew it then, know it now. They had, in 1922, nothing more to fear from a collapsed communism and a confused socialism. When he says confused socialism, of course, he's talking about the fact that the Socialist Party were pretty fragmented and had internal fights within them in period, whereas the right and the center-right in this specific moment in Europe was a lot more solid, if you will. As for Mussolini himself, he did not want at all to become the tool of capitalism, as he had never wanted to become the tool of anything or anybody, not even of France when he took her money in 1914. His plan was, and it always has been, to drive mad the passions of others, and, having deprived them of their intellectual independence, to make them the tools of his own passion. At length, he managed to do so even with the Italian capitalists, who fondly fancied they had drafted him and his bravos for their purpose. They wanted to use him monetarily for some Saturnalia of revenge. He permanently subjugated them. That's the fascist control of the economy. Now he's leading the chain which they drag, looking around to see whether all the rest of the world would maybe like to be riveted along with them and to give a share and comfortable feeling of unanimity and continuity. So that's the idea, you know, how I was talking about the shift between the early kind of pro-capitalist, pro-free market aspect of the fascist movement and how it eventually became, by this time of course, a totalitarian control of the economy. Not capitalistic, not free market. Neither did Mussolini acquire the mentality of an Agnelli or Pirelli or a Rockefeller or Ford, nor had or have those capitalists and non-owners the mentality and purposes of a Mussolini. Brilliant, he said. Last but not least, noble ones, to any who has followed me and reached this part of the... thank you for that, for watching so much. I think the best way to conclude this discussion that we've had about fascism being left-wing, right-wing, is really in the words of Gary Lodi. Open quotes. When the government's boot is on your throat, whether it is a left boot or a right boot, is of no consequence. Thank you for watching.